As we noted last week, the content of the 9th stage of Christian's journey was too large for me to adequately capture in 1 week, so we previously discussed the first half of the stage, particularly Little Faith and Flatterer and Atheist. And so moving on to the second half, we shall discuss the Enchanted Ground, Hopeful's Testimony, and Ignorance. The Enchanted Ground. On page 58 we read, "I saw then in my dream that they went till they came into a certain country, whose air naturally tended to make one drowsy, if he came a stranger into it." As Christian quickly identifies, this is the enchanted ground that the shepherds warned of, the place where travelers were lulled to sleep, never to awaken again. This concept is clearly a picture of the Bible's numerous commands for God's people to stay awake and be sober-minded. Speaking of his return, Jesus warned in Mark chapter 13, verses 35 through 37, "Therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake." Of course, the text in the margins is 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 6, which says, "So then, let us not sleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober." Likewise, 1 Peter 4:7 tells us, "The end of all things is at hand, therefore be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers." Spurgeon is right, I believe, to call the Enchanted Ground more perilous than all the trials that befell the pilgrims thus far. Indeed, we know that sleep is a gift that God gives to his beloved, and yet sleep of the Enchanted Ground is not the sleep of confident trust in the Father, but it's the sleep of presumption and sloth. It is a spiritual sleep that infects many who otherwise appear to be awake and alert. Spurgeon gives a threefold reason for this sleep's danger. He says, the sleeper is insensible, is in a state of inaction, and is in a state of insecurity. Those who are asleep have their senses shut down, they are inactive, and they are never easier to attack. Now, brothers and sisters, does this not describe much of Christianity in the West? Being free from persecution for so long and having more material wealth than any people in history are both breeding grounds for spiritual slumber. Of course, we ought to be thankful for both of those things, right? Yet we go wrong if we use them as a justification for sleeping, for slacking in our walk with the Lord, in our pilgrimage. Our wrestling against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places by advancing God's kingdom is no less a reality in times of material peace and prosperity as it is in times of persecution and poverty. One of my favorite counsels of John Calvin says this: "Let us therefore regard this period of quiet," and by that he means a lack of persecution, "not as something which will last forever, but as a truce in which God gives us time to gain strength, so that when called to confess our faith, we do not act as raw recruits, because we failed to think ahead." Indeed, we may gain strength and stay awake by keeping the blessed hope of Christ's return ever before our eyes, by being watchful in prayer and in the reading of God's Word, and by interceding in prayer for our brothers and sisters around the world who are actively suffering for Christ. But another means fighting off the spiritual slumber that may so easily overcome us is through the company of other believers. And that is exactly what Christian and Hopeful now do. Christian proposes discussing how they came to begin their pilgrimage, and thus we learn exactly how Hopeful came to faith. We might divide Hopeful's testimony of his conversion into 3 broad stages: guilt and avoidance, morality, and then saving faith. So first, Hopeful recounts that he was just as sin-filled as every other citizen of Vanity Fair, and then he heard of Christian and Faithful who proclaimed that such sins ended in death. This awakened in him the guilt of sin, though he first began to deny it vehemently. We can take a few notes from this first stage of Hopeful's conversion. So first of all, although Hopeful confirms that everyone knows that they have sinned against the Creator by rebelling against the law that he has placed in their hearts, that guilt simply leaves men without excuse. It does not pave the way for salvation. The beginning of the proclamation of the gospel must always first shed light upon the true darkness of our sin. Indeed, the goal of the evangelist is to preach the word of Christ so that the hearer may have faith to call upon the name of the Lord and be saved. See Romans chapter 10, verses 13 through 17. But how will anyone cry for salvation without first knowing their need to be saved? Guilt over sin must be awakened, and we must see our condition for what it really is. Also, we should note that on page 60, the honest reasons why Hopeful ignored his guilt, for they are a very fitting summary for why so many people desperately attempt to ignore the guilt of their sin. So he gives 4 reasons. 1, he was ignorant of that God was using that conviction of sin as the beginning of his conversion. 2, sin was still sweet to him. 3, he did not want to abandon his companions, his friends. And 4, the guilt was so troublesome to him that he could not stand to think of it. And then finally, on page 60 as well, 160 as well, we ought to consider all the things that brought his conviction of sin unwillingly back to his mind. Apart from a meeting of a good man or hearing the Bible, all the rest of his reasons have to do with pain, sickness, and death. This brings to mind C.S. Lewis's observation that pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. It is very often through discomfort and pain that the Lord, in his grace, refuses to let us run from him. Now, the second stage that Hopeful goes through is he turned away from his sin and then turned to thinking how he must endeavor to mend my life, or else, this is Hopeful speaking, thought I am sure to be damned. So he thus parted from his sin and his sinful companions, and he took up what we often call today the spiritual disciplines, right? Reading the word, prayer, speaking to others about the truth of God. But this lifestyle reformation could not assuage his guilt for long. We, of course, saw Christian himself being tempted with this way of life by Mr. Worldly Wiseman, who tried to convince him to remove his burden via morality. Here, Bunyan is essentially addressing the same problem, but just from another angle. For all his righteousness, Hopeful discovers through the scriptures that it was insufficient to save. Particularly, Hopeful realized that none of his good works actually served to remove the guilt of his previous sins. Thus, he realizes, even if he never sinned again, which of course we know is purely hypothetical, right? His original cosmic debt against the creator of heaven and earth would still stand against him. If his own righteousness, then, was so thoroughly insufficient, he would need the righteousness of another. This then led to Hopeful's conversion and his understanding and believing of the gospel. Faithful told Hopeful that Jesus alone was righteous and died to impute his righteousness upon his people, for whom he also died to pay the debt of their sin. Hopeful then prayed what we might call the sinner's prayer. Yet he did so, as he says, more than 100 times until Christ was revealed to him and he found assurance of his salvation. Now, this extended battering down of the sinner until he finally sees Christ was a common pattern of conversion that the Puritans were often known for, and it stands in stark contrast with the easy believism that is so frequent today, where the sinner's prayer is often prayed after an emotional sermon, and the assurance of salvation is immediately pronounced by the preacher. Now, I think Joel Beeke is right in saying that perhaps the greatest danger of some forms of Puritan preparation, and by that he means preparation for salvation, like what we've just seen here in Hopeful, is the lack of balance in their presentation. By using the law to hammer away at sinners over long periods of time, men like Hooker often neglected to mingle the sweet with the bitter. Their listeners could easily have lost sight of Christ in the midst of several dozen sermons on contrition. Jonathan Edwards offered a helpful corrective to this, as did the Dutch divine Wilhelmus Albrechten, who reminds us that in the mystery of the Spirit's working, we often cannot tell exactly when a person is born again, right? And so I think that we today can properly learn from a balanced view of those two, right? Is that we certainly don't want to go into the easy believism of thinking, of pronouncing upon people that say the sinner's prayer and then immediately affirm to them that they have definitively been saved, that they have been born again because they've made this profession of faith. And I think it's also can be a danger to go too far in, to read into the kind of account that Bunyan presents to us here with hopeful's conversion, a sort of pattern with which we must follow, and we must have a testimony that looks exactly like that in order to be convinced that we are truly converted, that we are truly born again. The simple reality is that, like Beakey finishes in his statement, speaking of Jonathan Edwards and Abrakel, there are many believers who cannot point to the exact date of their conversion, who cannot point to the exact time in which they were born again. For many believers, it is not the blinding light of Paul or the immediate realization of Augustine or the tower experience of Luther. Instead, it's a process. We don't know exactly when our souls came alive to the knowledge of God, came and became regenerate. We know that it was a particular point of time, but we can't remember exactly when that is. And so I think that Beakey is right, that there's a balance that needs to be had, that we're right to move away from that, from how so many of the Puritans could have viewed that preparation for conversion, and seeing that pattern that must be followed. And we are also right today in moving away from the easy believism of say this sinner's prayer and you are definitively saved, right? So let us have more balance to our discussion of the topic of conversion. Conversing with ignorance. So having recounted his conversion, Hopeful notices that ignorance was lagging far behind them, and he encourages Christian to slow down for him in order to talk with him. We chiefly see here that ignorance is ignorant of the ways of God. Yet his ignorance is like that of the Pharisees, to whom Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, 'We see,' your guilt remains." You see, an ignorant man who recognizes his own ignorance is at least at the very beginning of knowledge. But the one who thinks that he already is wise has a damning ignorance, for he won't be corrected. Well, there's much that we could say about ignorance, and indeed we'll observe Christian and Hopeful discuss him at the beginning of the next stage. Let us point out three broad topics here. First, we can see from the beginning ignorance is foolishness in that he desires to be alone. Proverbs 18:1 warns that whoever isolates himself seeks his own desires. He breaks out against all sound judgment. And that's precisely what we see with ignorance. He delights in isolation because he doesn't want to be challenged. He does not want to endure the sharpening process that walking with another inevitably brings. He therefore is the fool who despises wisdom and instruction. Second, notice that ignorance's conversation with goes on with Christian. His supreme authority is quickly revealed to be his own heart. On page 168 he says, "My heart tells me so." Now we, of course, should expect nothing less from one who is supremely devoted only to his own desires. Furthermore, we should also not be surprised to find that ignorance cannot acknowledge the wickedness of his own heart, because to do so would be condemning his God, his treasure, and his guide, all in one fell swoop. And third, because ignorance is unable to confess his wickedness, his understanding of Christ's justification is twisted in kind. His belief of justification is, quote, "Christ died for sinners, and that I shall be justified before God from the curse through his gracious acceptance of my obedience to his law." Or thus, "Christ makes my duties that are religious acceptable to his Father by virtue of his merits, and so shall I be justified." Now the grand problem here is, of course, that ignorance does not actually look outside of himself to Christ for justification. He only looks to Christ to supplement his already righteous heart and efforts. He is justified only in the sense that Christ seals his already assured salvation. But this is not biblical justification, which teaches that we must look solely upon the atoning work of Christ to be justified before God. Now, of course, sanctification, we can rightly say, involves our good works being offered to God, but even then, we're empowered by the Spirit. And yet, justification is purely a unilateral act of salvation. We are made righteous before God, not by any duties that we might perform, but only through the work of Christ being done for us. It's quite sorrowful to see much of our present world in Bunyan's portrait of ignorance here. May the Lord ever give grace to his people to look away from self, from our own hearts, and to look instead upon the righteousness and the satisfaction of Jesus Christ our Lord. Thank you for listening. Until next time, grace and peace.